Hello, this is Lady B, and this week, in honor of March and St. Patrick's Day, I thought I would share my recipe for corned beef and cabbage stew. Now, if you're not familiar with corned beef, it is basically the beef version of an unsmoked ham. An unsmoked ham and corned beef are basically both a pickled meat, which, if you're thinking of dill pickles, doesn't sound that great, but they use different seasonings and they are delicious. I have been known to corn my own ham, but beef is expensive enough that I pay someone else to do it for me. And I love this recipe. It has such a, if you've never had corned beef, just try it. It's impossible to describe. It's this wonderful flavor. And the soup, the broth is made from the beef itself, so it has that flavor through the whole soup, and it's just lovely. So the first thing I needed to do is to prepare my ingredients. And this is a slow cooker recipe, so only my first 5 ingredients are going in to begin with, and 3 of them are spices. So the first thing I have to do, of course, is to prepare my meat for my stew. Now, normally when you buy beef brisket or some other type of meat, you'll rinse it off. With corned beef, you don't want to do that. You want the flavor of the brine that's around it as well. So there's no rinsing that takes place. After that, you will trim off any excess fat, leaving just a little bit for flavor, and any hard connective tissue that you may find. I paid a little more for a higher quality piece of meat, so I didn't have to do that. All I had to do was then dice it into 1/2-inch cubes, as you can see here. And now my first step is very simply to put these first 5 ingredients into my Instant Pot, which I am using as a slow cooker. This is a slow cooker recipe. Corned beef is a tougher meat. You want to cook it slow, whether you're doing a roast or a stew. So my Instant Pot has a slow cooker option on it. The difference is that I use a standard 10-inch lid with it instead of the Instant Pot lid that seals it for pressure cooking. So my first ingredient in my soup is 2 cups of water. The meat will be providing its own broth. We do not add any broth to this. We want the flavor from the corned beef. So just water. Then for seasoning, in addition to the seasoning that came on the roast, because it will have spices on the roast, leave them on there. They're delicious. In addition to that, I also have here my herbs. I have a 1/2 teaspoon of marjoram and oregano, dried. My oregano, I actually ran out of my dried, so I have a 1/2 tablespoon of fresh, because when you are substituting fresh and dry, your fresh you have to use 3 times as much to get the same amount of flavor out of it. And then the last spice is basil, which I have a teaspoon of dried. And this goes in here also. And then I add my meat. So a little tip for cutting your meat that I forgot to mention. When I cut raw meat on obviously a plastic or rubber cutting board, I like to put it in a tray so that if there is any juices that spill, they stay inside the tray and they don't make a mess on my counter. So that's just a little tip for the future. But back to the soup. So I have my meat and my water and my seasoning in here. And my water is not covering my meat completely, and that is okay. We're going to get juices off of the meat. That is actually what we want. I like a really chunky stew. If you don't like it as chunky and you want it a little thinner, then you can add broth, 1 or 2 cups, to make it thinner. But this is how I do it. So once I've made sure everything is down below or near the top of the water, even in it, I'm then going to put my lid on, and I'm going to set it to slow cook. Okay, so you can either cook this in the slow cooker for 3 hours on high or 4 to 5 hours on low. And I was going to do it on low, but I've run out of time, so I have to do the high setting. Okay, so I'm going to press my slow cooker button here, and I've got it set to 1 hour 30 minutes, and I want it on high, which this says normal, but I want to make sure it's high. So I'm pressing the slow cooker button again and going to more. Every time you push the slow cooker button, it will cycle through the different heat levels. If you have a standard slow cooker, then you would just set it on high. This takes a 4-quart or 1-gallon crock pot. And now I just have to prepare my potatoes, because my potatoes are going in halfway through, which is why it's only set to 1.5 hours instead of 3 hours. But I'm going to prepare a little more than the potatoes. I'm also going to be making some soda bread. This is not my recipe, and we'll see how it turns out. But what's a little corned beef and cabbage soup without some soda bread on the side? So I'm now going to go scrub some potatoes and then prepare to make my soda bread. Okay, time to make the soda bread. Now, like I said, this is not my recipe. I am trying out a recipe from a website called Let Them Eat Gluten-Free Cake. And cooking with gluten-free flours, you do have to make a few adjustments. For example, in this one, there's a little more soda, a little more water, because gluten-free flours require a little more hydration than wheat flour does. But I'm going to give it a try, and we'll see how it turns out. So I guess I'm going to do a review too. So step 1, I have here 3 1/4 cups of her bread flour mix that she has on her own website. I have already started preheating my oven to 450. And now I need to mix my ingredients. I have here 1/2 teaspoon of fine salt that I'm going to put in. And then I have a teaspoon of baking soda, which is where the name comes from. It's a quick leavening bread. Now, soda bread is kind of like, the texture you're looking for is very similar to what you want for, say, southern biscuits or a scone. So you're not going to want to, there's no kneading. You're not trying to develop any gluten or anything. So the key is just getting all your ingredients together. So I'm going to whisk these together with my whisk. And then to this, we add 2 cups of buttermilk. Now, I'm in a dairy-free home. We have people with allergies. So instead of buttermilk, I have here 1 3/4 cups of coconut milk and 1/4 cup of distilled white vinegar to get the acidity needed to activate everything. And I'm supposed to make a well in this to pour in my buttermilk. Now, I actually have just a little bit more than 2 cups, so I'm going to leave just a little bit in. I might need it, I might not. Just a little bit remaining. There we go. We'll mix that and see if I need the rest of it. Now, like when you're making biscuits, you don't mix it a lot. You just mix it until it comes together. And when I was reading the comments on her site from people who tried it, inevitably, the ones who didn't have it turn out, it's because they mixed it a lot. You want it to just come together. Yeah, I need that last bit. So I probably had like an extra tablespoon. There we go. So I'm mixing it just until it comes together, as I said. But I'm making sure to get all the flour from the sides. And I just want it ragged. I don't want it smooth. I don't want it kneaded. I just want to make sure I have all the flour. Oh, there's some in the bottom there. All right. So now, dump the dough on a floured surface. So I have more of my flour mix here. it says to put some more on the top, which I'm not sure I need to because I didn't quite get all of it together in the inside. There we go. And it says to coax it together into a large round. That's very helpful. There we go. I think that's a large round. What do you think? It's still quite rustic. Okay. Let's see. Next step, I believe, is to put it onto my parchment. I have here a baking sheet with parchment on it that I had already set up. And we'll move that into the middle. Cut an X into the top. And I watched her do this, and it's not a small X, it's a big one. So, cutting an X into the top. Big, giant X. And then brush any remaining buttermilk over the top. So, in lieu of a brush, because I don't have one with me right now, I'm just going to use my fingers and just pat it on top. So now I need to take this, put it in my oven for 15 minutes at the 450, drop my temperature to 400, and then cook it for another 25 minutes. So I'm going to go put that in the oven and be back here in 6 minutes to put my potatoes in. I just made it in time. My hour and a half is up, and I had just a couple minutes in order to drain my potatoes. I had them in water in order to keep them from turning brown while I was working with the soda bread. So now I'm very quickly going to take the lid off this and pour in my potatoes. And I'm going to stir it, make sure my potatoes are down in my liquid. And oh, this is starting to smell so good. I'm getting so hungry. I have not eaten enough today. So now that my potatoes are in, I am going to put my lid back on and cook it for another hour and a half. So my soda bread is done. I tapped it with a spoon after the 25 minutes to check and see if it sounded hollow, and it didn't, so I gave it another 4 minutes and then it was finished. And I took it out of the oven, and you have to let it cool for 15 minutes before you can cut it. Now I had another half hour or so on my soup, so I actually let it rest for 15 minutes and then covered it with a cloth to keep it warm. But now we can cut it and see what it looks like inside. See if this worked or not. Let's cut a slice here. Oh, and that is beautiful. See if you can see that. We'll just put a little margarine because I can't have butter. I'm going to tear off a piece and give it a try. Or soda bread. So if you can't do gluten, check out her blog. It's Let Them Eat Gluten-Free Cake, and she has all kinds of great recipes. But now it's time to get back to my soup. And it has finished and is on keep warm. So now it's time to add the last ingredient, which is the cabbage. The recipe calls for a half a head of cabbage, but my cabbage head was very small, so I only did, I did 3/4 instead of a half. But I just cut it in shreds about 4 inches long, and I'm just going to fold this into my soup, and the heat from the stew will cook the cabbage. And when you first put it in, there's going to be a lot of cabbage. You're going to think you have too much, but as it cooks, it will shrink. And that's it. I stirred for about 2 minutes. The cabbage cooked down, the juices from the cabbage added to the broth, and now I have a full pot of corned beef and cabbage stew. And there you have it. Corned beef and cabbage stew, a slow cooker recipe. Now, if you wanted to do this while you just walk away, you can put the potatoes in from the beginning. They'll just be cooked a little more than I prefer. I love you all, whether new or old. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week. Until then, whether making Irish stew for St. Patrick's Day or anything else, just remember, don't be afraid to suit yourself and make whatever it is you do exclusively you. Now you just, as obviously I'll have to clean this up. They've been dried.